Guys, thank you so much for joining us. I am delighted to be joined with Beryl Quigley, who I've got to know over sort of the last few weeks. Got to know you and Peter. I'll say this, I'm a big fan already of yours, and I think what you're going to share today is needed for us to hear, especially in the country that we live in, but especially after what John has shared around the invitation that Jesus gives us to love our enemies and how countercultural that is, and how action-oriented that is. So let's, if you don't mind, Beryl, how are you sat here? How did your story bring you here to talk about Jesus' invitation to loving your enemies? What's your story when it comes to that?
I suppose growing up, going to Sunday school and church, etc., without realizing it, you're taking in a lot of what Jesus said. And sometimes there are significant times in your life when the presence of Jesus just breaks in a very real way.
Right.
And yes, we've heard all the things he said, don't do this and don't do that, and do this, do that. But you're never sure how that's going to apply to you or how you're going to cope with it until it happens. And then there is the living experience. So the topic of loving your enemies, I feel that Jesus was encouraging us to love our enemies because it's about a heart thing. If your heart is bitter and angry, it affects your hearing because you begin to hear through that filter.
Right.
You begin to see things through that filter. And you listen to people who talk like you. And so you're not actually growing. You're almost dying from the inside. Your heart is getting hard and cold and bitter. And that's not a good way to live. And that's why I believe that Jesus was encouraging us to love our enemies. He wanted us to be well.
Right.
He's our Savior, but he's our healer. So he's trying to bring those aspects of humanity that we can fall into. He's trying to get them sorted before they become a real problem.
Now, you have had first-hand experience in a way that 99% of people won't. Beryl, your story, I actually couldn't believe when I was chatting to you on the phone originally about your story. How has this been a reality in your life? Can you share that with us?
Well, it's a story that was set back in 1984, a long time ago. It's almost 40 years. But you know, as a believer in the Lord and a follower in the Lord Jesus, there are things he puts into your life that equip you for the days, years, and months ahead. And I'm very grateful that the Lord spoke to me in the midst of a tragedy. So in 1984, I was much younger and married to a guy called Bill McConnell, who grew up in East Belfast, went to Sullivan Upper School in Hollywood, went to Queen's. While he was at Queen's, the troubles in Northern Ireland, those awful years, were escalating. And I don't know what went through his mind. I didn't know him at that stage, but he chose to go in and work in the Northern Ireland Prison Service. And he went in as a governor grade, an assistant governor. And the prisons became a really difficult place, mostly filled with young men who'd been lifted out of their homes, perhaps because of the area they lived in or their name or their education. There was a lot of awful things happened during the Troubles. And so it was a melting pot of anger. And there was hatred between one tribe and another, but there was also hatred of the prison staff who were looking after them. And during the Troubles, there were many people who lost businesses or lost their lives for all kinds of reasons that sometimes we don't even understand, and sometimes there were mistakes made. Bill's name obviously came about on somebody's list that he needed to be taken out. And so on a Tuesday morning at the beginning of March 1984, Bill was sitting at home having his breakfast. Our little daughter, who was 3 at the time, was sitting in her high chair having breakfast, chittering away. I went outside to do the loving thing of wiping the windows clean and making sure the mirrors were clean. And I always checked under his car, just in case there was anything strange.
That was a normal procedure.
That would have been the normal procedure for a lot of people. But while I was outside, I noticed there was activity at the house across the road. Now, the house was lived in by our elderly neighbours who were in their late 80s and wouldn't normally have been up and about at 8 o'clock in the morning. But what I was seeing was their car wasn't in the garage, it was sitting in the driveway, and it was facing to drive out, whereas they always drove in and reversed out. And then I saw someone coming out of the back of their house, which was on the driveway. And I thought, something's not right. I hope they're all right. I hope they're not ill. But I went back inside, helped Bill on with his coat. We said our goodbyes, we had our hugs. The three of us walked outside to say goodbye to him. Bill was standing at the side of the car beside the driver's door. I was standing at the side where the passenger door was. Gail was standing at the front of the car, and we were just talking across the top of the car when my attention was drawn to the neighbour's house across the road again. And there were two young men coming down the driveway with guns, and they were, I think, they were automatic pistols, so they were maybe pulling something. I don't know the action, but they were doing something to prepare to shoot. And I shouted at Bill. He looked, saw what was about to happen, turned and started to run. But the first gunman was only a few feet away from him at this stage, and he just shot. I think it's 6 bullets in an automatic pistol. I think most of them went into Bill's head, and he fell. The other gunman, who was smaller in stature and running behind what I call the first gunman, was shooting, I think, in my direction. I was almost on the ground in my hunkers, trying to move in the opposite direction to not be shot. I wasn't shot. I wasn't injured in any way. The guns became quiet. I heard the gunmen walking back down to the gate, and the car, our neighbour's car, was sitting at our gate. Obviously, this was the getaway car, and they jumped into the car and sped off. I stood up, looked over at Bill. There were several holes in his head and blood was pouring, and I thought, he's bound to be dead. He couldn't possibly survive this awful shooting. And the first thing I felt, I didn't need to go to him. I couldn't have done anything. And I still had the moisture of his kiss on my lips.
Oh.
And I thought, I need to go in and make sure that little Gail doesn't come back out to see this terrible mess. So I went into the house, phoned the emergency services. A neighbour who has medical knowledge, she had come up from her house, she'd heard the gunfire. She checked Bill and he was dead, and came in to me and said, you really need to go and get dressed, because Gail and I were still in our night clothes. And there was a conversation that went on between me and Jesus. I felt he had entered right into my most devastating crisis in my life. And he was saying, Beryl, what are you going to do about this? And I was saying, Lord, what do you mean? I don't know who these people were. I don't know which tribe they belong to or who they represent. What are you asking me? And he reminded me of the Lord's Prayer, the prayer he taught his disciples. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Going on to that bit where, forgive me my sins as I forgive those who sin against me. And I stopped and I said, Lord, are you asking me to forgive these people? Because I don't know that I could ever do that. But if I need to have clean hands and a pure heart to stand before you when my day comes, then I choose to forgive, but you're going to have to help me every day.
Wow.
And the Lord is faithful. He is true to his word. And it's almost 40 years until the 6th of March. It was the 6th of March, 1984. And for those almost 40 years, the Lord has been faithful. And not only faithful in that particular episode, because I actually started to pray for those gunmen. And for others that I then since heard were part of a larger group of people who planned the murder. And I prayed for them. There was only one of those 2 gunmen that went to prison because his DNA or something was found in our neighbour's house and in the car that was used as the getaway car. That was the evidence that was brought to court. But it has allowed me to pray for other situations and to know the Lord's help in other situations that have arisen during those 40 years since. So it has hugely equipped me. And I keep on saying, Lord, this is a new situation. Will you help me in this the way you've helped me in that other situation? It
is a remarkable story. And again, like I said, 99% of us will never be faced with that situation. But your willingness and your obedience to Jesus and how countercultural that was, because it actually got media attention.
Yes.
Right? Because they came to your house to interview you.
Yes, they did.
Pretty soon after.
Yes.
And you said, God has told me to forgive them. Which they couldn't believe.
That's right. Because before that, every time I watched the news, and we did watch the news almost by the hour to see what was going on in the country, people were full of hatred, looking for justice, looking for something. And I'll tell you about justice. If I had been saying, Lord, I need justice in this, I would never have got it to satisfy me, because of the 2 gunmen, there was only one went to court. And he was the one that was shooting in my direction. So the guy who was shooting and shot Bill didn't ever come to court. So where was my justice in that?
Wow.
Then all those years later, after that, what I call the second gunman got out of prison, I didn't know about it until I got a phone call from a journalist saying, did you know that so-and-so had got out of prison this morning? And I said, no, I didn't know. I said, I've been praying for him. And my prayer today is, now that I know that he's going home, that he'll be able to rekindle his marriage and get to know his kids that he's been away from all these years. And that maybe he can put some of this stuff behind him and live a more fulfilled and happy and contented life. Now, where would my justice have been? Because he got out of prison. Whereas some of the people that I was seeing on television wanted people to be locked away for the rest of their lives. So you can't always get the justice that you feel you deserve. So we have to leave an awful lot of stuff in the hands of the Lord. And he's got big hands, he can cope with it.
It is a remarkable story. And you carry yourself with such a humility and a gentleness, and yet the power in your story and in your testimony. I can't help but feel when I encounter a fraction of what you've had to encounter with your life, I believe because of your story that I too can walk in your footsteps and love others. And I know you want nothing more than for people to live the Jesus way.
Yeah.
Isn't that right?
Yes. Yeah, because it's healing, it's positive, it's life-giving, not just to yourself, but to anybody that you can help along the way. Help them to work through that pain and that anger and say, look, you're just going to have to lay it at the foot of the cross.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being willing to share your story. I have no doubt people will be inspired. And thank you for your faithfulness in 40 years, in the midst of grief and mourning, choosing to love the Jesus way, because your impact has been amazing. So thank you, Beryl. And thank you guys for watching and listening to Beryl. I've no doubt it'll encourage really exciting conversations as you go. So bless you. And thanks for checking out this episode of our Sermon on the Mount series.